As the US announces plans to focus its military might in the Asia-Pacific, China says trouble is brewing. Stay with news analysis as we ask whether new regional equations are in the making.
Tensions between Beijing and Washington have been running high since President Barack Obama unveiled a new national defense strategy. Washington on Thursday announced plans to counter China's growing defense capabilities by strengthening its military presence in the Asia-Pacific region, despite fiscal constraints.
The new strategy is less boots on the ground and more of the air wars. A lot of the U.S. targeting of its perceived enemies has been through drone attacks, targeted killings.
Fearful of Chinese military dominance, it also mentioned the need to have Beijing's strategic intent clarified to avoid what it calls frictions in the region as China's military power grows.
This is not a question of strategy, really. The strategy comes out of the need in this country to satisfy the weapons lobbyists who spend millions of dollars every year to buy votes from the American Congress. And they have institutionalized the military. Now, what is the strategy? The strategy seems to be the same old thing. Control as much as you can control of the world and punish all of those governments who don't obey you.
Beijing has called the charges in the defense guidance groundless and untrustworthy. It has urged the U.S. to avoid what it's called warmongering policies and instead play a more constructive role. Plans to strengthen the U.S. military prowess in the Pacific come as Washington, the world's largest military spender, wrestles with a looming debt crisis due to years of war in Afghanistan and Iraq. The budget crisis has gradually reduced trust in the dollar that was once seen as the world's reserve currency and an advantage to gain trade. Asia's industrial giants that have their currencies pegged to the dollar are now seeking to find good value for the long-term global investor and a better means of trade to avoid the jitters caused by an unstable U.S. economy. In December, China and Japan in a surprise deal agreed to ditch the dollar in bilateral trade and instead use their own currencies. Experts believe such moves will ultimately lead to an era when the dollar is no longer dominant.
Well, joining me now live from Washington is Mr. Michael Malouf, a former Pentagon officer. Thank you for being with us, sir. Also live from Madison, philosopher and former Marine Corps officer, Mr. James Fetzer. Thank you very much, sir. And with us on the line from Beijing is host of China Radio International, Mr. Paul James. Thank you for being with us. I'd like to put the first question to Mr. Michael Malouf in Washington. Mr. Malouf, what does the U.S. mean when it says there's, quote, a lack of openness in China's military policy?
Well, for years, the Chinese military has been somewhat closed to the U.S. military. The United States has been trying to engage more of a military-to-military relationship, but because of our relationship with Taiwan and wanting to sell them weapons and things like that, the Chinese have basically closed down that avenue for the most part. But through intelligence and other means, the United States is able to, and also from comments made by the Chinese, they're able to see what the Chinese intentions might be. And the Chinese have been very open about wanting to assert themselves more into the South China Sea and to tell foreign countries such as the United States, and I might add India, to stay out. They regard that as their sphere of influence. So
right, well,
all of this is beginning to develop a crescendo that this year may actually create a problem.
Right, well, Washington has said that there is some regional friction involved, and because of that, it's going to expand its military presence in the region. I'd just like to bring in Mr. Paul James from Beijing. Mr. James, do you think Washington does see China as a security threat, at least in the long term?
Yes and no. There's a larger question that lies in here, and it's one of intent. Whether or not Beijing is putting out the signals, I guess, if you want to put it in that respect, toward how it's going to react to the situation across the Taiwan Strait. The issue of Taiwan, of course, is one of paramount importance for Beijing, because Beijing considers Taiwan to be a renegade province and one that eventually will be reintegrated with the mainland. You've got critical issues there, and in particular this year, as our esteemed colleague from Washington was just mentioning, one of the big issues is going to be the election in Taiwan, which is going to take place very soon, which is going to shape the way in which Beijing approaches its policies moving forward, as far as its strategies, as far as its military is concerned. You've got also issues with the South China Sea, which are, of course, heating up as well, which was also mentioned. The United States, of course, trying to put a sphere of influence in there vis-a-vis its allies with the Philippines and with Japan as well, also sort of, as they say, sticking its nose in the situation. So it'll be an interesting time to see how this year plays out as far as defense policy and defense strategy is concerned from Beijing, also given the fact that you've got a leadership change coming up here in Beijing as well.
Right, let's go to Mr. Fetzer now. Mr. Fetzer, what do you think are the strategic interests involved now, with Washington turning towards the broader Middle East, from Iraq and Afghanistan to the Pacific region, which it's considering as the epicenter of, so to speak, the new security challenges that it's going to face?
Well, there are two ways to incur the wrath of the American government. One is when strong nationalistic leaders appropriate property owned by American companies, as Fidel Castro did in Cuba with regard to Anaconda Copper and United Fruit, which, because it would cut into their profit margins, led him to be declared to be a communist and an enemy of the United States. Salvador Allende in Chile, who was, of course, elected in a democratic election, but it was to the detriment of ITT. So since he was cutting into the profits of another big corporation, he too was identified as a communist. Now we have a whole series of nations, including Iraq, Venezuela, and Libya, who have gone from the petrodollar to the petro-euro. That's really very much what's at stake here. If there isn't the artificial propping up of the American dollar, then a country is going to suffer. The situation with Iran is a perfect illustration. It poses no military threat to the United States whatsoever. Iran hasn't invaded a country in 300 years. It has a military budget of about $8 billion. Compare that to the United States, which has a military budget of $1 trillion, which has 800 bases around the world, where Iran has none, and where we have massive military might. The idea that Iran should pose a threat to the United States is simply absurd. The blunder that China has made in the eyes of the American administration is that agreement with Japan that they're going to trade in their own currencies rather than the American dollar. That's what's going on here. The claim that it's a matter of military defense or national security is camouflage for the fact that we're talking about economic competition, and that the American corporations or American bankers or American oil companies are going to suffer because of the no longer dependence of those nations on propping up the dollar using the petrodollars. That's what's going on. Well,
let's look at what China has been saying about this. Mr. Malouf, one commentary in a Chinese paper by Rear Admiral Yang Yi says that, quote, it's clear that the new defense strategy is targeting China and Iran, and that the U.S. is the regional, quote, troublemaker rather than protector. What's your stance on that?
Well, I think the United States indeed plans to stay in that region for quite some time. That's what Afghanistan is about. Afghanistan is really about looking at what is going on in Iran, and also to contain China. Also, I might add, to lend support ultimately to a rising India against China. India and China are about ready to go at it again over lingering border disputes, and also the fact that India wants to introduce its own navy into the South China Sea, which has created additional friction between China and India. And the United States is supporting India in that regard because of its own claims to the rights of international passage in the South China Sea. And I might add that India also is linked up with the Philippines and with Vietnam over disputed resources in the South China Sea, which China lays claim to. The United States supports in not only India, but also Vietnam and the Philippines in those claims. China basically has told the United States, this is not your area of interest, and just butt out. But for some reason, the United States insists upon maintaining its position there. And as long as it's still under some illusion that it is a world power, that it's able to afford all of these activities. And the fact that the United States is broke, I think, is it just hasn't gotten to certain policymakers in the Pentagon.
Well, I'd like to go back to that financial aspect of this, but before that, I'd like to ask this question from Mr. James as well. Now, Mr. James, looking at the relations now between China and the U.S., would you agree with this analysis that the U.S. is just keeping an appearance of maintaining a cooperative relation with China since it is bending more towards Japan? And could there be some kind of confrontation, even a military one, between the two sides?
Well, the currency swap issue is one of growing interest here in China. The authorities here in Beijing have been pressing to, as they call it, internationalize the renminbi, the Chinese currency, by initiating these currency swaps to try to divest itself away from the U.S. dollar. Now, to the extent of which this is actually going to create any sort of grander use of the Chinese currency on the world markets is yet to be seen, because there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to internationalize and make the renminbi a tradable currency and a usable currency within the basket of currencies themselves. That being said, of course, economics do play a very critical role in the way in which Beijing and the United States approach their relationship, because of the mass scale of their economies, the way in which their economies are so interlinked because of the consumer-driven economy of the United States, and of course, still much largely an export-driven economy by China. That being said, with the Chinese now pushing away from their export-driven economy and trying to build up a domestically driven economy, the reliance on exports to the United States dwindles down. And we've already seen over the last few months a little bit more protectionism here in China as far as its economy is concerned. They're talking about becoming more protective of not just imports from places from the United States, but of the way in which the technology transfers are handled and things of this nature, which is creating tensions on not just on the trade side, but also on the geopolitical front. And to say that it may lead to some sort of armed conflict, I think might be a bit of a stretch at this point, but it's certainly not helping much as far as the overall relationship is concerned.
Well, let's look now at the financial aspect of this and the economic cost of this for the United States. Mr. Fetzer, when we are speaking about the budgetary problems that the United States is currently facing, with this announcement about its new defense strategy, of course, President Obama was saying that this is an effort to overcome, rather, the fiscal constraints. But others are saying this is rather a move, the move to Asia, to the Asia-Pacific region, is strategically vital for the U.S. To let budget issues come in the way, since it will still be ranking first in defense spending. Its total national defense budget, we know, is $703 billion.
Well, the United States, unfortunately, is on a war economy. It's wars that produce profits for the military-industrial complex, and when there are no wars, their profits dry up, which makes them most unhappy. Since the demise of the Soviet Union, the United States has continued to emplace a series of bases in Eastern Europe surrounding Iran and now tending to surround China. Those countries, therefore, have legitimate concerns about the American military presence, which poses a clear threat. Even though Iran does not have nuclear weapons and poses no threat to the United States, even some leading American politicians, such as two candidates for the Republican nomination, Mitt Romney and Rick Santorum, have talked about first strikes on Iran, which would be in gross violation of international law, including the Hague Convention of 1899, the Kellogg-Briand Peace Treaty of 1928, and the United Nations Charter, which declares that no nation may attack another without the approval of the Security Council of the United Nations unless it's facing an imminent threat. There is no imminent threat from Iran. Even a spokesman for the American Enterprise Institute has acknowledged that nukes have nothing to do with it, that their concern is with an increasing Iranian sphere of influence, principally economic and political, in the Middle East. This whole military business is a charade, and it has no justification under the law or in fact.
Mr. Malouf, I'd just like to refer to comments made by the U.S. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta when he was describing this defense strategy. He said that the U.S. is focusing on creating a smaller and leaner military force with greater strength, however, that's more agile and more flexible and ready to deploy and to be innovative and to be technologically advanced. Now, when President Obama is saying that he's aiming to rather make the U.S. force smaller because of the fiscal problems that it's facing, how do you interpret that remark?
In a number of ways. Number one, it's going to have a much more flexible ability to move carrier task forces. It probably envisions cutting back on a standing army rather, and probably doing more special forces type of training, so that you can have insertion and in hot areas where there might be conflicts. I don't think the trend is any longer going to be putting massive amounts of troops into areas such as we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. First of all, we cannot afford that, but secondly, this has been an age-long battle that I know that's been going on at least since the days that Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld was in office with the standing military and trying to reform the U.S. military. And then Iraq came along and that stopped all of it. But the trend really is to try and make the military meaner and leaner, as you say, but also to make it more surgical and to be less and to get away from this idea that there's a war that we didn't like, a concept that existed during the Bush administrations. And so I think that, and this is actually a pulling back from the peripheries, just as you've seen now that the United States is pulling back a little bit from the Middle East. And so they're going to put their concentration where they're much more comfortable, and that would be in the Pacific because of our allies there, namely Japan and all the other countries such as Philippines, Vietnam, but also, once again, I mentioned India because that's going to be a critical, important country along with the United States, basically to contain China. And that seems to be what the net assessors in the Pentagon are basically saying where things are going to be heading with respect to activities with China. They do projections out to 2020, 2030, and that's probably where they're looking right now as where the major areas of concern are going to be, particularly with the rise of China. China itself is becoming more of a blue navy. They're expanding their military. They're coming up with more exotic military type of items such as their ballistic missiles and also new weaponry for electromagnetic pulse attacks, which could be used against carrier task forces. So all of these things are of increasing concern from a geostrategic standpoint to the United States.
Well, Mr. James, it's all too well if the United States is going to make more contribution to peace and stability in the Asia-Pacific region, but it's also possible that militarism will cause a lot of ill will, some people are saying, and will meet with a strong opposition in one of the world's most dynamic regions. Now, that's one analysis that was made by the Chinese media. Would you agree with that?
Well, it is, and there's a certain element to the strategic dynamic that China plays in this particular region, because China sort of takes on a dual role and is taking on a more of a dual role over the past couple of years. Traditionally, China's sphere of influence in the Asia-Pacific region has been in East Asia, trying to extend its sphere of influence over places like North Korea, the Korean Peninsula, Japan, to a lesser extent Taiwan, of course. But over the past couple of years, the authorities here in Beijing have been making a sort of quiet but a fairly consistent push about extending their sphere of influence into the Western part of its sphere of influence, in particular the stands, if you want to call it that, the Central Asian countries. And in particular, one place that is going to be of key interest, which our guest from Washington alluded to as well, is India and Pakistan in particular. Now, the Chinese authorities have always had a very strong relationship with the government in Pakistan. This goes back decades to the Cold War, when China allied itself with Pakistan while the Soviets allied themselves with India. This really hasn't changed all that much as far as the dynamic is concerned. Of course, China and India have had border skirmishes in the past, which is always sort of a lingering area of contention as well.
Right, Mr. James, if I could just stop you there, if I may. Because unfortunately we're running out of time. I'd just like to give the last comments here to Mr. Fetzer in Madison. Mr. Fetzer, if you could tell us in less than a minute, what do you think, how will this play out when you say that this is only a cover in the US's confrontation with China? How do you think this is going to play out between two sides?
Well, if Japan can survive the Fukushima disaster, which is not yet clear, the great economic and manufacturing engine is now between China and Japan. The United States is in the last stages of decay of the American empire, parallel to the decay of the Roman Empire, overextended, economically incapable of sustaining its own ventures abroad and leading ultimately to a political and economic collapse, I am very sorry to say.
Philosopher and former Marine Corps officer Mr. James Fetzer joining us there with his comments from Madison. I'd also like to thank former Pentagon officer Mr. Michael Malouf joining us from Washington, and a big thank you to host of China Radio International, Mr. Paul James, on the line with us from Beijing. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this edition of News Analysis from me, Homo Lesgi, and the rest of the team here in Tehran. It's goodbye.